Welcome to the Golden Crane Award-winning Color Success Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. I am so excited today to have Brianna Calderón on today's show because she is a licensed mental health counselor in the state of New York. She is a native New Yorker from the Bronx and started out working in community mental health and group homes and residential settings. After becoming licensed, she made the switch to No Compulsive Disorders Help, NOCD, in hopes of working in a position that is more clinical than behavioral, and is now an OCD specialist working via telehealth. Her personal and professional mission, which is near and dear to my heart, is to provide education on this misrepresented and misdiagnosed disorder to communities that may not have access to resources and have generational or cultural stigmas regarding mental health. Today, we're going to talk about what really is OCD and what is the gold standard treatment. We'll also explore panic attacks and disorder and treatment as well. Brianna, thank you so much for joining me on today's show. I'm so happy that you're here.
I am so happy to. I'm super excited to get into it and talk all about this area of expertise that I'm really passionate about and share the information that's out there and really to represent OCD in the way that it's supposed to be represented and not the way that people assume it's represented.
Yeah, so let's get into it. Can you define for us what is OCD and not the media perception of it per se?
Absolutely. So I could go off the DSM, our diagnostic statistical manual, but those are all kind of cut and dry, very monotone criteria. What we like to think of OCD as, or how we conceptualize OCD is, it consists of two important things: intrusive thoughts, images, or urges that you experience as unwanted. So anything that might be a weird thought, a scary thought, a thought that you feel like you get stuck on and you can't really let go or you fixate of, or it could be something triggered by something environmental. The other piece of it is that it consists of compulsions. And there's a little bit of debate about this because I'm sure in people's research, they've heard of something called pure O, and pure O talks about having pure obsessions without compulsions. Now, as an expert, I have a little bit of a hot take, which probably really shouldn't be a hot take, but the idea is that you can have obsessions without compulsions. And in our work, we pretty much realize that the definition of compulsions is already part of that definition of obsessions. The obsessions itself are just thoughts, urges, or images that you really don't want to have, that really don't make you comfortable, and that you didn't ask for. But the other definition of obsessions is, what do you do about the obsession, the thought, urge, or image? Do you try to fix it? Do you try to suppress it? Do you try to neutralize it? That's all part of the definition of the obsession part. And that's still a compulsion. I think that people really get caught up in compulsions are something you have to see, you have to quantify, you have to actually be able to visualize and see someone doing it to recognize that, oh, they must be acting in a compulsive manner. What people really don't recognize is that compulsions can absolutely be mental acts. They don't have to be physical behaviors. And I think that that's where we get really caught up in what is OCD, because people, the way it's portrayed in media, the way it's been, branded over time is cleaning, tidiness, arranging, contamination, all the big ones, right? All the ones that you can really visually quantify. When it comes to these intrusive thoughts and these kind of typical pure O things where people aren't necessarily doing something physically, people also do mental acts. And what are mental acts? Mental acts are just thinking, right? Anything can become a compulsion. Overthinking can become a compulsion. It's called rumination, mental checking, mental reviewing. We do something called rewinding the tape. Rewinding the tape is a mental act that most people do, and that's going back into your memory, stopping the VHS of your mind, of your memory, and really kind of freeze framing and honing in on a past experience, a past interaction, and analyzing the hell out of it. And everyone does that. We as human beings do these things. The thing is, people with OCD do it excessively, and it becomes counterproductive. And the reason that they do it, the intention behind the behavior or the mental act, the compulsion, is to relieve some anxiety or distress that thought brought you. So in a whole, you really can't have obsessions without a compulsion, because a compulsion doesn't have to be a behavior. We want to ask, are you doing something to fix this thought? Are you doing something to neutralize this thought?
And repetitively.
repetitively? Yes. Are you doing something to suppress it? It could be as simple as having a bad thought and trying to replace it with a good thought or a good memory, neutralizing it or sanitizing it. And that's really where people get hung up on, is that we really want to be able to visually see things happening in real time. We want to be able to witness someone doing a compulsion, but you can't just witness someone doing a compulsion. A lot of people who have OCD have this mental piece where they're not doing physically anything. They're stuck in their mind for a lot of the day.
So how can you differentiate between someone who likes to be fairly neat, may clean something once or twice, and we'll get into how the pandemic has really impacted people's perception of germs and things like that, to someone who actually has a diagnosable OCD situation going on?
So the difference is, what I always tell my members is that we don't want to change your standards. A lot of people see, especially when it comes to like the contamination, the cleaning, the arranging, the being neat, people see that as an asset, because it is an asset. People do want to be clean, especially living in a pandemic world. You want to wash your hands. You want to be able to protect yourself. You also want to be a tidy person. Most people want to have some semblance of control over their home environments and be able to really, sift through their organization and be organizational. The problem is people with OCD don't just stop at the organization. They don't just stop at the results. It goes beyond that. It goes beyond just seeing the results. So for example, if I am a organized person, I personally am not an organized person. I'm a complete mess in my own home. But if I'm looking at someone who has that organizational, symmetrical type of obsessions and compulsions, this person goes beyond just being neat. This person feels the urge, the need to rearrange things, to line them up in a way that is counterproductive to their efforts and actually makes the problem worse. It reinforces the problem. So for example, if I don't like anything tilting, if I don't want any of my picture frames tilting, or if I don't want certain things in my home out of place, I might have some guests, and some guests might, put things out of place. Maybe I have a party and some, pictures get knocked down, or some pictures are, tilting off the wall. For a person who just wants to organize, they are going to organize it and leave it. It's going to go away. They're going to fix it. They're not going to look back until the next time it gets messed up. For a person with obsessive compulsive disorder, they cannot move away from that. It is too hard to deviate from that task at hand and go focus your attention elsewhere. This person is fixated on doing it a right way. They are fixated on fixing it. And the fixing it piece is still not comfortable. It still makes you feel pretty bad, because your brain is telling you there is no right way of doing things. There is no end to this formula. You have to arrange things and line things up until you feel like it's right, until the anxiety or the distress has gone away. The problem is that it's a temporary fix for a longer term problem.
And I think what's really important is that there is actually significant distress, and it starts impacting various areas of your life. Some people may even avoid having parties because they don't want people touching their stuff or putting a cup in the wrong area. And even with one's family, it can really be difficult because they want to arrange, we'll use the tilting example, they want to arrange it in a very specific way. And oh goodness, if you have kids, like that is very, very difficult, right?
Perfection's unattainable at that point.
I mean, for anybody. And then at that point, it's, all's fair, right? In terms of where things go and how they move things. So I think that's the important part, is there is a significant stress that happens in various areas of their lives, as with most diagnosable disorders. But I mean, how have you seen the pandemic really play into OCD? I mean, have you seen an increase in patients that you're seeing, or a greater demand?
We definitely see. So I came on to OCD, during the pandemic. I came on to OCD about a year ago, March 2021. So we were already kind of halfway through, through today, that mark. What I do know is that when the pandemic started, telehealth overall, just not even, honing in on just OCD, but telehealth overall boomed. for all the obvious reasons. We couldn't get out. We couldn't go to an office. People needed to see their therapist because they got thrown into a situation where you could not physically see anyone. And it happened almost, in a 24-hour period. So people really struggled to get access to care and to transition from being in person all the time to not being in person for what felt like almost eternity. Mm-hmm. So people really isolated themselves. Now, in terms of OCD, what we see is like going back to your point, the significant distress becomes functionally impactful. People's functioning deteriorates when they are fixated and stuck on a thought loop, pretty much. So when you take all that access to different environments away in a pandemic world and you isolate someone to their home, usually their home is the breeding ground for compulsions. Why? Because people do compulsions publicly. That's absolutely true. Sure. But people will tend to check their compulsions if they know there is a negative public perception or stigma that comes with it. And they'll usually rely on their compulsions to kind of go crazy at home. So when you isolate someone to their main environment, they have no choice but to go through all their compulsions. And usually the people who were getting maybe OCD ERP therapy in person and had to transfer to at home, they didn't understand how to translate those exposures when they went from being in person all the time to only being at home. Right. Now, on that note, telehealth is really important for especially OCD and for exposure response prevention to work, because I can really do good work working with someone in their own natural habitat. I can't do great work in an artificial setting where I have someone coming to an office and I control the whole environment. I decide what goes in it and what doesn't go in it. When you work with someone at home and you're really telehealth doing therapy over Zoom, you are able to see them in whatever environment. You can conduct a session at home, as long as obviously you are licensed in the state that you are meeting.
Disclaimer, people.
Just to make sure everybody's aware. You can meet with people at their home. If their triggers are in their home, which there always usually is. If the trigger is outside, you can conduct a session while the person is just going about their business, encountering what they are usually avoiding or triggered by. So it's really important for ERP to work in a space where you don't have control over the environment. You allow the environment to be the environment, and we guide the person into learning how to navigate those triggers without relying on the compulsions, which is what we want to cut out.
So you alluded to ERP and as one of the gold standard treatments. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that looks like and what is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So exposure response prevention, ERP, that is the type of treatment that we do here at NOCD. And it is the gold standard treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder overall. What does that mean? Exposure is exactly what it sounds like. We are exposing you to something that you are probably fearful of, you're apprehensive to, you're hesitant to engage or participate in, or something that just generally makes you uncomfortable. Now, the person who is receiving services is responsible for the RP part, the response prevention. And response prevention means that your therapist is going to take care of the E. I'm going to expose you to something that distresses you, and your responsibility is to not do your compulsion. Now, that seems easier said than done, but there is a process that has to happen here. We can't just say, okay, don't wash your hands. Mm-hmm. Easier said than done. If it was that simple, we wouldn't be here, right? It's not about just not doing the behavior. It's also about delaying it, reducing the frequency until it's eliminated, and maybe doing it in a way that you get as close to the compulsion as possible, but not completing the compulsion. So for example, if I have contamination OCD and I tend to wash my hands a lot, an exposure I might do is I'm going to ask my member to go to the sink, turn on the water, and just maybe touch something dirty first, right? Or maybe touch nothing at all, depending on where the person is at in therapy. If they are deep into therapy, we probably will have them touch some dirty stuff because they've built up that momentum already. But what we want to do is we want to have the person be able to turn on the faucet, hover their hands over the sink, get close to doing the action that their OCD is telling them they should do, and then making the conscious choice to not do it. It's going to increase anxiety. And I think that's where people get really kind of turned off. They're like, well, why would I go to therapy if it's going to increase my anxiety? Because the avoidance that we've built to try to not feel these anxious feelings, to try to feel better, has actually reinforced the problem. The more that you wash your hands, the more that you decontaminate, the more that you respond to that thing in your brain that's telling you, do this, do that, do it repetitively, do it a lot, do it consecutively. You are reinforcing that in order for you to feel better, you have to do this thing. And that's not true. That's your OCD telling you that you cannot feel better, you cannot move on unless you follow these rules. And we're teaching you, exposure response prevention is going to teach you, you absolutely can move on. It's still going to be hard, but you can move on without relying on these things.
So when you say touch dirty things, what are we talking about? Because again, in my mind, of course, I've done ERP with a number of clients, but I can imagine listeners being like, well, what kind of dirty stuff are therapists making you touch and then not washing your hands?
Yeah, absolutely. It really depends on the person. It depends on their triggers. It depends how far they're willing to go. As a therapist, I will never put you in danger. I will never do anything that I would not do myself. So if that means that I have to model doing the exercise, like touching something dirty to prove that it's worthwhile doing, I will absolutely do that. We encourage that. But it also depends on the person themselves. What are they willing to do? You know that we can't force anyone to do something that they're not ready to do or that they won't commit to. Our job is really to suggest and to encourage and to push those boundaries. But if I'm working with someone who's really, really willing to, challenge their OCD all the way through, I've had people put their hand in toilet water and just sit there. I know therapists who have had people do, even grosser things that, yes, it's not something that people would typically do on a regular day habitually, but we're going to do it now because our brains are telling us this is taboo, this is wrong, we need to stay away from this. And it's building up this defense mechanism of fear and avoidance that seems almost impenetrable, and it's not working. It's counterproductive. It's not helping the person. It's just making the person feel more fearful, more scared, more apprehensive, more distressed.
Yeah. And in a previous episode, we talked about exposure therapy for needle phobia. And one of the most important things that Dr. C talked about was that fear hierarchy, that you're not just going to put your hand in the toilet right away. That's flooding. I mean, no pun intended. I mean, we can do that, but talk more about this fear hierarchy and building up to, the more challenging fears that someone may have.
Yep. So in the OCD ERP community, our hierarchy is our treatment plan. And it's an ever-evolving document pretty much. So what we like to do is we want to be able to identify, what are your obsessions? What are your core fears? What are you really afraid of? For someone with contamination OCD, I mean, there are so many layers to it. It could be, I'm worried about getting sick. I'm worried about spreading germs. I'm worried about spreading germs and causing other people to be harmed or get sick. All those things can constitute specifically just contamination OCD. But the hierarchy makes us take a look at, where do all your fears lie on a rating scale? We want to work up to the most distressing thing. So when we work with someone with OCD and we're doing ERP, we're going to literally rank your fears, all your triggers from 0 to 10. Where do they lie? And we are going to start at the foundation, at the bottom, from that 1 to 5 scale, really. All those things that fall into that 1 to 5 scale that our member has identified, we're going to work on that first, because if we work on the 10s, just like you said, it's going to be flooding. If I tell a person in our second session, go touch the toilet water, they are going to have a flood of emotions. They're not going to trust me. They're going to be turned off to therapy. They may not come back. So that's something we never want to do. We want to work on the bottom half first. We want to build up that foundation so the person builds up kind of an immunity to these things that are less distressing, so they feel encouraged and committed and ready to work on the stuff that is that level, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that's really hard, because even the stuff that is 1 to 5, it still elicits anxiety. It's still distressful, but it's really good practice to be able to get to the 7, 8, 9, 10s, because doing the 7, 8, 9, 10s at session 1, 2, or 3 is not going to help the person learn anything. They're not going to want to come back. And why should they, when you've thrown them into a situation without teaching them anything?
Absolutely. And I think it is important to educate the client early on that, hey, you're going to want to quit, especially as you go higher and higher up the fear hierarchy. And it is about that therapeutic alliance and that trust, to say, trust the process, trust me as a guide, and knowing that it has to get a little bit worse before it gets better. just so that they understand and prepare for what is coming, and they don't just, again, start to avoid the sessions. And if they do and they come back, really having that conversation and confronting that avoidance is so key.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of that's when we do our first like full diagnostic and intake sessions, we are looking at, listen, I have to give you the disclaimer. I have to tell you what to expect because it's only fair. You are receiving a service and you need to know what to expect. It is going to get worse before it gets better. Not because, and I always tell people, I respect who you are as my member, and I want you to know that I care about you. I want you to get better. I don't respect your OCD. I want to starve your OCD to the point that you are no longer a puppet for your OCD. Now your OCD is not in control. It's still there because thoughts are thoughts. Intrusive thoughts are going to happen. Everybody has intrusive thoughts, even if they don't meet criteria for OCD. You can't stop the obsessions from happening per se. You can absolutely control your responses. And we get there by challenging your OCD. We make you stronger by starving your OCD from what it wants and making sure you have the tools to consistently remember how to starve your OCD.
Absolutely. So let's transition a little bit. I mean, it's still an anxiety disorder, but let's talk about panic disorder and panic attacks. A lot of people say, I'm having a panic attack, but what does that really look like in terms of diagnostic criteria or things that you look for?
What we look for to diagnose panic disorder is, what have you experienced? So is there a trigger? Panic attacks can be triggered by something specific, but in order to meet criteria for panic disorder, some of those panic attacks have to be unexpected, not a clear trigger in the moment. We're looking at a rush or surge of discomfort or fear, usually always manifesting in somatic symptoms. So we're talking about hyperventilating, sweats, chills, hot flashes, heart palpitations, increased heart rate, numbness or tingling sensations in your fingers, toes, face, digits, really somatic, fearful symptoms that you feel in an onset in about a few minutes. And usually it will last a good amount of minutes, but it shouldn't last like an hour. I've heard of people having a panic attack that lasts about 15, 20 minutes, and they do experience those intense somatic feelings. But what we really want to look for is the physical symptoms, the somatic symptoms. And if the person is experiencing these attacks, some of them are unexpected. So you don't see a very clear trigger. Now, that doesn't mean that all of the attacks have to be unexpected, because there, of course, is going to be some trigger that you recognize that's more clear to you. But there are going to be a significant amount of attacks that have not had a clear trigger. You felt them come out of nowhere and you weren't even expecting it.
And most people go to the ER for that, and then they see us, right? They get the green light. Hey, nothing is actually physically showing up as abnormal. And so I think it is really important to understand what may be going on in your life and in that context. Of course, we always want to rule out any physical or medical issues at that point. The and part is it really can be helped. And so what kinds of interventions do you do when someone comes to you with panic attacks and panic disorder?
So at NoCD, we don't specifically work with panic disorder itself, but a lot of OCD components can lead to panic attacks, because what you're looking at is people having intrusive, fearful thoughts, not knowing how to deal with them, and feeling this rush of fear that's absolutely can be related to obsessive compulsive disorder. We are, as a therapist, and you know this as well, empirically based therapeutic interventions are the ones that we want to go to. Why? Because they have the evidence, they have the efficacy. We know that the majority, it will work. It will elicit some type of change, as long as, the therapist does their part and the member or client does their part. That's the part of the therapeutic alliance. Panic disorder can be treated with those evidence-based practices. So we're talking about CBT and exposure therapy as well. One thing that we don't want to do is avoid, which is the easiest, most comfortable thing to do. If we don't like something, we just stay away from it, right? But a lot of times what people do is they change their lives around, which is another criteria of panic disorder. Have you made changes to your life in an effort to avoid a panic attack or to prevent a panic attack. These are things that we don't want to avoid. Why? Because the triggers are probably not going to go away. What sets off your panic attack is, even when the unexpected panic attacks happen, it's not just going to go away on its own. And oftentimes when we fixate on it, it makes the symptoms worse. Mm-hmm. So what we want to do is we want to be able to teach the person to navigate through a panic attack, not avoid a panic attack, because that's not the solution. Avoidance is rarely the solution in these types of things. So we want to be able to teach someone to navigate their panic attack in a way that teaches them long-term to decrease those somatic symptoms. You are not forcing yourself to decrease the somatic symptoms. We are just guiding you through the panic attack so that you can, next time, the recuperation period is quicker. And next time your brain is able to condition itself in a faster time and come out of that panic attack and maybe decrease some of those symptoms.
Absolutely. And I think there's so much going on in the world right now, sociopolitically. And I know you're in New York, I'm in the Bay Area. And so there's a lot of activism going on, and obviously a rise in hate crimes in our communities. And so how do you think intersectionality really plays out in communities of color in terms of manifestation of these symptoms?
Absolutely. So I don't know if you have heard of the Brooklyn subway attack that happened a couple of weeks ago here in New York. Usually when a event like that, or an event like what we are recently experiencing with the Supreme Court leak and Roe versus Wade being in jeopardy. When events like this happen, usually people's symptoms increase. Why? Mm-hmm. Because OCD is telling you, be scared of this. And then this legitimately scary thing happens. And OCD is like, see, I told you, you could have prevented it. You could have, some hand in this not happening if you just listened to me. And that's never true, right? OCD is a liar. Although it can latch onto rational, realistic things, the way that it's telling you to fix this problem is never, ever the solution. So when these things happen, especially in the state of New York, and especially because I live in the Bronx and New York City is a very diverse place, mm-hmm. everyone kind of feels the weight of this. However, all those events translate differently into different communities. We're looking at how do we treat people of different nationalities, different racial identities, different sexual orientations, mm-hmm. gender orientations, but those are just the really big disability status as well. Those are the really big eye-catching topics. Within each of those communities are sub-communities. We have different cultures in each of those communities. Where I come from, where I'm in the Bronx, it's not the same as Brooklyn. It's not that different. It's still New York, right? But what I experience in the Bronx is not maybe what someone experiences of the same racial identity or gender identity might not be what someone in Brooklyn experiences or in New Jersey, right? So mm-hmm. We really have to take a full clinical picture of what and who this person is. When we're looking at intersectionality, we have to acknowledge everything that you are and how your OCD manifests in everything that you are. Usually what I hear from women of color, Black women, Latin women, Asian women, Middle Eastern women, these women are usually, we feel under attack most of the time.
And there's a reality to that as well, right?
There's an absolute reality, yes. Because it is, and it's so easy for OCD to latch onto that because it's a valid worry. When it's something that's a little bit less realistic or tangible or concrete, sometimes they're still experiencing the OCD symptoms, but they can, more rationalize, this is realistic, this is not realistic. Mm-hmm. When it is realistic, it's really hard to differentiate what is my gut instinct, what is me being precautious versus what is obsessive and compulsive. Mm-hmm. The way I look at it, or the way people who treat OCD look at it is, the whole clinical picture, what are you doing to exacerbate or reinforce your fears? When the Brooklyn subway attack happened, most of my members, mostly women, the women members that I have, were terrified. A lot of them live in New York City. A lot of them take public transportation. Now we have an increase in compulsions because people are taking hyper precaution. They're avoiding the train. They're doing a lot of things that they have worked so hard to get past. And it feels almost like we're regressing because here's this very tangible attack and this very possible thing that could happen. And I need to do everything in my power to prevent that. that's fair when it's something as valid as an attack or abortion rights being jeopardized. But the way that we get there is rarely the way that the solution that it needs. It doesn't help to just reinforce the fear. Does that mean that the fear is invalid? Absolutely not. It's a rational fear. But by doing those things, by avoiding and engaging in compulsions, we are just reinforcing that this thing is scary. It's scary for a reason. We're women, we're prone to attacks. We, are often fetishized, we're sexualized. We are working against those types of stereotypes. And now we have to protect ourselves in a way that's realistic, but we also have to protect ourselves while not engaging in compulsions. And how do you do that when you have every reason and every right to want to protect yourself excessively?
So, especially with compulsions, it's about a sense of control, right? And that's pretty difficult to do in this world nowadays. And so what are some ways, though, that it can be more productive control? That's not a clinically coined term, but I'm thinking, how can we give someone a sense of control when the world is so uncontrollable right now?
So the way I explain it to everyone is you can only control what you can control. And that sounds silly because obviously, right? But you can only control what is your responsibility. When it comes to OCD, and I literally have just been today honing in this theory for everybody that I met with, you cannot stop your thoughts. Obsessions are not bad or good thoughts. They're just thoughts that your mind fixates on. Everyone has intrusive thoughts. I don't care who tells you what. If they told you that they don't have intrusive thoughts, they're not being fully honest, or they haven't identified what could constitute as intrusive, right? Everyone has these thoughts. OCD is the doubting disorder. It's a disorder that makes you question everything, and yet it makes you feel like you need to be in control of every aspect of your life. You can only control what you are responsible for. In an ERP OCD perspective, you are in control of not your thoughts, but of your responses. And the responses are the compulsions. And a lot of times when people fall back into the pattern of doing compulsions, after they've kind of worked on them, it's because they feel like everything in their life is out of control. And the one place that they do have control is their responses, which is always interesting to me, because the same way that people say, I can't do this, it's too hard, I'm not able to do this. And in the same breath, someone's like, oh, but I know I can control my compulsions because I have the choice to not do them or to do them. It's just really, really hard. OCD is an over control disorder. It's telling you that you have full control of everything in your life, and that's just not true. You have some control. You have control over your responses, your reactions, your actions, but you don't have control over what the world and other people throw at you. So relinquishing some of that control, and this sounds kind of like an oxymoron, but relinquishing and acknowledging some of that control actually helps you gain more control over your life and makes OCD control a little bit less, because now you're saying, I know that I have just a responsibility, but I don't need to try to make everything my responsibility. Not everything is my responsibility, just some things. My reactions are my responsibility.
So how did you become so passionate about this particular topic and treatment? Because it's not something that people go into school and say, I want to work with people with OCD and tell them to stick their hands in toilets, not to minimize what we do. But, it is something, when we specialize in something, we have some spark for it.
I will be fully transparent. My goal for myself when I was young and in college was to be a medical examiner. I wanted to be a coroner. I was really into like forensic files and all these like FBI true crime shows. And then I dipped my feet a little bit into pre-med, and it was never going to invest myself in that much. I just could not see myself doing it once I kind of got a taste of it. But I still really liked science. I've always loved science, even though I haven't been maybe the best at, science and calculus and math and things like that. I still really like science. So to me, psychology was the next best thing, because it absolutely is science, but it's the science for your brain. And what is more misconstrued than people's brains, because you can't see what's going on in there. So that's really where I got my foot in the door with making the decision that I'm going to go to grad school for mental health counseling. I'm going to try to be a therapist. Then you go to grad school you graduate and you realize that you are equally as inept as you were the day that you went into school.
It's a new level. It's like
it's a new
now
level
you're
of
actually
inept.
responsible for real human beings.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not scary, but it's troubling to know that you come out of grad school and you don't automatically become an expert. Because that's the way I felt. I was like, I got my master's, I'll eventually be a licensed mental health counselor. I must know it all. And then you realize that it is harmful to say that you are an expert in everything when you are an expert in nothing. That doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help you as a therapist, because you can't build a client base telling people that you're an expert in everything when in reality, you're probably an expert in just a couple of disorders. I wanted to be an expert in something. I didn't know what, but I wanted to be an expert in something eventually. So my trajectory was got out of school, started working in community mental health, stayed in there, got my clinical hours done. Once I got my clinical hours done, applied for my license in mental health counseling, took the test, which is hella hard for anyone that took the New York State, the NCMHCE.
And you used a Bay Area word, hella. So yeah, I mean, over here, it's hella hard too. In California, they got all these other hoops and stuff. So
yes, it's California, New York are the two states where licensing is so rigorous, because we really want to make sure that our therapists are well trained and are ready to enter the world treating other people. So once I got my license, I was like, okay, what do I do next? Always typical millennial. What's the next step? I just got to keep going up, Found NoCD. And this was about a year into the pandemic, where I was like, I really don't want to go back to work physically. I'm really not into it. I know my capacity of getting work done at home is good. I can do good work. I really want to try telehealth. And by this time, telehealth was really booming because of the pandemic. Went on Indeed.com, like most people do, found NoCD, and a year later, it is the best career move I made, because I think I've learned more in this 1 year than I've learned probably throughout bachelor's and master's.
Wow, that's a huge statement. So, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Where can people find more about NoCD and your journey and all your educational resources?
So everyone can go to NoCD has an Instagram, Treat My OCD, treatmyocd.com. If you think that you might have some symptoms, that align with what we discussed today, or if you want to do some more research to see what else is out there, just to make sure that these symptoms are aligned, your symptoms are aligned with what we discussed, go to Treat My OCD, our Instagram, our app. Our NoCD app is very helpful. It's free for everyone to use. There is no commitment. You can get the NoCD app and literally just join support groups. You don't have to commit to doing individual therapy with someone.
Amazing.
The support groups are absolutely free, and they are headed by one of our clinicians. They're educational tools, and they're really good at helping to educate people on what you might be experiencing and breaking the stigma of what you're experiencing. Because a lot of OCD, like we discussed, it's not just that physical contamination, arranging, symmetry stuff. It's also these intrusive thoughts, which can get really scary. We're talking about harming people, harming yourself, fear of bad things happening, fear of harming your child. Postpartum OCD is something that we really talk about. Our clinician, Jenna Overbow, her Instagram is full of useful information for all these different types of OCD, especially postpartum OCD. And now with Roe v. Wade, it's something to definitely educate yourself more about, because this is something that women and people who can give birth have been dealing with for a longer time than it's been a diagnosis, and it just hasn't been fully understood up until recently. So if you want to go to Treat My OCD Instagram, please go and download the app. It's free. Support groups are free. You can navigate it yourself. There's no commitment to going to therapy. It's really for you to get your feet wet and understand what OCD is about and connect with a community who's struggling and who's still, a lot of our community members, we have forums that you can talk about some of your symptoms, break that stigma, feel like you're not so isolated, because OCD is extremely isolating and it makes you feel like you're the only person in the world going through it. You are special. Your OCD is not special. You are not the only person going through it.
And are the therapists in various states, or is it only in New York?
All over the country. We serve every state in United States. The UK we serve, and we serve a couple of, I'm pretty sure we serve Australia as well. So we are becoming global. And as telehealth laws, you meet with a therapist who is licensed in your state.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your story and all of your expertise. This is so helpful. And for anyone that is looking for help with OCD or any resources, please visit those Instagrams, those websites that Brianna just shared.
Thank you so much for having me. I've had so much fun, and I really enjoy being able to educate people.
Thank you so much for listening to the Color Success Podcast. Listen, like, subscribe on all major streaming platforms, YouTube, IG, and if you want exclusive content, you can join our Patreon. All links can be found at colorofsuccesspodcast.com.